But another album we do need to dwell on, because I think this is, again, one of the most important records of the whole era, Scritti Politti's Cupid and Psyche. Or to give it its full title, Cupid and Psyche 85.
Yeah.
Just in case you have any doubt what era it was made in. This is fascinating in the sense that this is a band that have transitioned from being, we talked about how the Thompson Twins had come from that sort of almost commune culture, making very right-on, politically correct DIY music. And Scritti Politti would, a couple of years earlier, that's exactly what they're doing. And suddenly they come out with the glossiest.
Yeah.
I mean, we talked about the Prefab Sprout album From Langley Park to Memphis having that big glossy Disney production. It's here too, isn't it, in spades on Cupid and Psyche 85. It's I think it was all recorded in America. It has a very American sensibility. The drum sounds are very sampled, very clipped, very precise. It's a very clean production. These very, very chintzy, almost chintzy, bright keyboard sounds. But his voice, that faintness that he's Paddy McAloon to the power of 10, isn't he? When it comes to the kind of faintness in the voice.
Well, they're almost lacking humanity. I mean, I love
almost
both
lacking,
their voices, but I
right.
there's lacking humanity.
Yes.
I mean, this is kind of a in some ways...
artificial intelligence voice.
Yes. Or a prelude to the era of autotune, because they're so perfect, so smooth. But at the time, it was so extraordinary to hear that. And
it still sounds extraordinary to me.
And it's not only him. Obviously, he's honed his songwriting, honed his voice, has this immaculate production. But the other people, I think a couple of them come from the Material and, experimental...
Yeah, Fred Gamson, is that the guy that was in Material? Yeah, could be.
There's at least some players there, I think, from Material, Bill Laswell and what have you. That era, that again, they come from an avant-garde American background. And I think that when Green was younger, I think he said that he was very much into the kind of communal creative living. He used to follow Henry Cow around.
Yeah.
So he knew these sort of... And when you listen to early Scritti Politti, who are fascinating with the early singles, very disjointed. Again, it kind of fits in with the post-punk sensibility rather than Henry Cow's rock in opposition. But by God, is it strange? But it's very unorthodox chord and rhythms.
But that's interesting because this album, which it makes Thriller sound like White Light, White Heat.
Yes.
But you mentioned the word strange. It's almost so perfect. It's got an otherness to it, a strangeness to it by virtue of this perfection, of this almost pristine, clean, glitzy production. It goes beyond what's just... Because it could have fallen flat on his face and ended up sounding very bland. But it goes so far in that direction, it becomes strange.
Well, almost an art form in itself.
Yes. Yeah. It's like an art project.
Well, I think he'd said that he had gone home. I think, I'm probably getting this completely wrong in some way, but the early singles... they're extraordinarily jagged. His voice is still quite natural. His voice is still kind of interesting and smooth and not very post-punk. The band are, but he sounds nothing like 79 or 81. And then obviously they did the first album, Songs to Remember, on Rough Trade, wasn't it? Which features Robert Wyatt, I think, on one of the pieces. And there are a couple of tracks that do hint at this. He's using aspects of reggae, aspects of funk, and his voice has become even more...
Sweetest Girl,
Yeah, Sweetest Girl. It's become even more rounded and smooth. But it still doesn't anticipate this.
No.
But I heard that in between this, that he'd had some form of breakdown, gone back to his parents, and had been immersing himself in the biggest records of the era, namely the Michael Jackson.
It's one of the most
albums.
Luxuriant sounding records of the whole era.
Yeah.
And I think what's bizarre about it is when you know where it came from, where they were doing 2 or 3 years before that, you would never have predicted. It's almost like the ABC thing. ABC obviously went from being an industrial band to making the Lexicon of Love album in the space of a few years. It's a similar transition, even more pronounced, I think, in the sense that this is one of the most clean, luxuriant, highly polished productions of the entire era. And lest we forget, we can draw a line back to Miles here, because Miles was so taken with this record that he ended up covering a song from the record from this album on the next album he made, Tutu. And similarly, Miles ended up returning the favour by performing trumpet on Scritti's following record.
Yeah, Oh Patty, wasn't it?
Oh Patty, which is essentially a kind of, it's a rerun of this record. I think there's something about this record, it's like there's nowhere to go.
Yeah.
There's nowhere to go after you've made Cupid and Psyche. It's so perfect. There's nowhere to go. And I think they always suffered a little bit from...
Yeah. I mean, I think some of his later stuff's been very good.
But he's only made like 3 records in the ensuing 40 years or something, hasn't he?
But he's kind of reverted to a slightly more experimental approach in his later albums. It's really interesting. As you say, it's more interesting because of where it came from. And again, like Prefab Sprout, with the airbrush photos, they really looked the pop part in 1985 as well.
They did, yeah.